So one of the things, this is the sort of penultimate ethics lecture. We have a guest speaker on Friday, and I'm going to say a little bit about her topic during the course of this lecture. One of the things that we talked about over the course of the semester has been questions about equality, and to some extent we've hinted at questions about justice, but we haven't really got into them. So this lecture today we focused on some questions and issues and ways of understanding different conceptions of justice. We've talked a lot over the course of the semester about values, about harms, and about interests, and about well-being. And we did spend a good deal of time talking about responsibility, which is very closely related to questions of justice. The last time I gave a lecture, we talked about animal ethics and some of the questions of equality that we raised in that context. And we also talked a little bit, just to remind you, about how to weigh competing interests. And that weighing of competing interests has been a theme throughout the semester, particularly when we're thinking about sort of economic interests and utilitarianism from an economic point of view. But we also spoke a little bit about consequentialism or utilitarianism from an ethical point of view, thinking about whose interests count and how to count them, and then how to determine what course of action might be right or wrong based on bringing about the best consequences. And so today, I want to focus on questions about justice, which are really quite different, because sometimes, as we'll see, justice demands doing something that actually might not lead to the best consequentialist outcome. Okay? It might be that there are certain concerns about doing something that's fair, or making a judgment based on a principle about what's right, that actually may not lead to some maximization of well-being. Okay? So these general theories, utilitarianism or consequentialism on the one hand, and maybe more principle-based or justice-based theories on the other, often do lead to the same conclusion about rightness or wrongness, but sometimes those come apart. So I just wanted to give you that little bit of background before we get into this. Now, environmental justice is not just about justice. Environmental justice is actually about, very specifically, about a disproportionate burden that falls on people of color and others, which we'll talk about. It's actually called environmental justice, but it's really about environmental injustice. And the idea is that there are burdens that disproportionately impact those who are in not a particularly good position to address those burdens. So it's kind of a magnified set of burdens. And particularly over the course of this semester, we've occasionally talked about this, but we've generalized a lot, both in terms of the negative impacts of the environmental nexus, but also to some extent in terms of some of the solutions that we've been talking about more recently. The burdens and the impacts of climate change, of food scarcity, of water scarcity aren't equally distributed. And to some extent, the solutions and the access to solutions to these problems aren't equally distributed either. One of the things that happened in the early days, in the 1970s, when Earth Day was first when we first started Earth Day, was that many of the environmental organizations that were organizing to raise awareness about the environmental impacts were overlooking this disproportionate burden that was falling on communities of color and poor communities. And so what happened as a result is a group of activists got together and started sort of raising these questions under the banner of environmental justice. Unfortunately, the changes that they've demanded haven't really come about, although there have been some, and I want to mention those. There is in the Environmental Protection Agency a special unit that deals with the disproportionate burden of toxics, for example, and environmental impacts on communities of color and poor communities. And I just want to say a little bit about this early history in case you're not aware of it, because it was before your time, most of your time. And so it really started in, and if you want to look, there is actually a timeline on this website. Oh, I don't have the URL here. Well, it's pretty easy to find. It's the EPA. So you could just look at it. There's an interesting timeline. In 1982 is usually when people sort of started thinking about the environmental justice movement in the United States in Warren County, which is a predominantly black county in North Carolina. And there was a decision at that time made by people not from Warren County to bring a bunch of PCBs and bury those PCBs in a landfill. And there was activism around that and marches and sit-ins. They did not win these protests, but it really did start a new wing of the civil rights movement, so to speak. The environmental justice movement is often thought to be a new wing of the civil rights movement. In 1987, there was a really important report on the hazardous waste siting. So what was discovered is that putting toxic waste facilities, deciding where to put toxic waste facilities was happening disproportionately in communities of color. And you might think, well, putting waste facilities in poorer communities would make sense because land is cheaper and corporations need to do something with their toxic waste. And there's perhaps less of a chance that other industries are going to be using that particular land. So maybe it just makes good economic or corporate sense to put, you have to put the waste somewhere, right? You can't distribute it evenly across, I've often asked my students when I talk about this, with your computers, there's a little tiny bit of toxins that are associated with the production of your computers. It would be a really strange world if when you bought your computer, they also gave you the little bit of toxins that were associated with it. Part of the reason you don't want to just sort of spread it out to everybody who uses a computer, it doesn't make good sense to do that sort of thing. Plus, we don't know what to do with it. What am I going to do? Carry around a bunch of toxins? I probably want to pass it off to someone. Hey, could you take these toxins? I don't want these toxins, right? So there might be good economic sense for putting this waste in poor, let's say, places where land is cheaper. As it turns out, in this study that was done in 1987 and then was revisited in 2007, class mattered, but it didn't matter as much as race. So what these studies found is that even in middle class racial zip codes, this work was all done based on zip codes, they were still more susceptible to the siting of toxic facilities by race rather than class, which is a really interesting finding and disturbing, right? Disturbing. In 1991, the first National People of Color Leadership Summit was initiated, and that's when indigenous organizations, as I said, groups that were active in the civil rights movement sort of took up the environmental issue. And in 1994, which is also a really interesting year for other reasons, President Clinton signed an executive order that led to sort of the enforcement of and attention to the EPA focusing on these kinds of disproportionate sightings. You'll see if you decide to go that they're still working on it. There's an EJ 2020 action agenda in which the issues around the injustices that many poor and communities of color face based on environmental damage is ongoing. And of course, we know that things haven't changed that much since the timeline I've given you. There's lots of little examples in between because we just heard about Flint, Michigan, right? So there's all sorts of ongoing concerns about this disproportionate impact. We also heard, and these are some slides from Nixon's presentation about water a couple weeks ago, and the slide up at the top just behind you. This is the CHIPCO movement, often thought to be the earliest instance of women organizing against environmental impacts and environmental destruction. What these women are doing is trying to save a tree from being cut. And we know that tree cutting and reworking water, diverting water, makes it the case that women are going to have to work harder to collect firewood and collect water all across the globe. And there's been a number of interesting studies about the ways in which women and children are impacted first and most by not just environmental destruction, but by climate change as well. And you might say, well, why is that? Why would women and children be impacted first? You might remember a cartoon that Professor Nixon had on his slide, which is what the men were sitting around watching the women do their work. And the idea is really that women who are primarily responsible for caring for children around the globe are also have lower status. And so women are disproportionately impacted by these things as well. And we're already seeing that there's certain people who live in geographical areas, for example, island residents, that are becoming climate refugees. They're already sort of losing their homes. And a recent report from last year from the Environmental Justice Foundation, which was a British organization, found that tens of millions of people will be forced from their homes by climate change, creating the biggest refugee crisis the world has ever seen. That's the word. So there's geographic disproportionalities, there's gender disproportionality, there's class disproportionality, and there's race-based disproportionality. And so in light of that kind of disproportion, we might want to think about what we should do to try to achieve justice. What would be fair? So take out your clickers. I will try to do this right this time. I'd like to see what you say. What should we think about these disproportionate burdens? Everybody should put in an equal amount to remedy problems and search for solutions. It's only fair that those who benefited should put in more. Those who have more should put in more. So that's just about if the rich should just give up more to the poor. Or if people have more due to fair exchanges, they're entitled to what they have and aren't unjust, keeping what they earn. Ready? Here we go. Yes? Okay, looks good. Equal and not. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, let's see how we did. Oops, I screwed up. Sorry. I wasn't supposed to push A again, I was supposed to push B. Okay, sorry about that, folks. Let's do that again. Yes, thank you. We all did it again. Now B. Okay. All right, so is that right? Does that look like it's mostly reflects what you did? Okay, so what we have is mostly it's fair. Sorry, let me move that over there. So mostly we have more or less B and C. That those who have more should put in more, and it's only fair that those who benefited should put in more. Some people thought D. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Some people thought A, that And I think that that's really interesting. So what I'm going to suggest is that we need to think about different conceptions of justice in order to be able to justify any one of these particular answers. Okay, let me get rid of that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about different principles of justice to start with. And then we're going to actually have to dig deeper into these kinds of questions. So there is a general view that if you think about justice just on its face, that what that means is that we ought to treat everyone equally. Now, we talked a little bit about equal treatment when we discussed animal issues. The last time we had an ethics lecture. But really, the idea that is captured in this notion of everyone ought to be treated equally, and again, we have to wonder who everyone is. We have to make an argument about who everyone is. Do animals count or not count? Does the whole world count? Does just certain current generations versus future generations count? All of that is talked about. But assuming we have a sense of who everyone is, there is this very firm commitment across all different theories of justice that there should be formal equality, which is often thought about as equality before the law. You could think of it in terms of the International Declaration of Human Rights, for example. It's this idea that you take everyone's, who counts, interest into account equally. So it's not really equal treatment, because we'll see why in a minute, but it's equal, you think of everybody equally. That's the way one way to think about it. And that's a pretty non-controversial. Once you get the little details worked out, most people think about equality and justice as being linked in this way. But there's lots of differences in thinking about what we should do to actually think harder about specific practical instances of justice and injustice. One, and that's the question of substantive equality as opposed to formal equality. Very easy to think, yes, we should all be considered equal. Everyone who matters should have a say, an equal say. But what does that actually look like? So substantive equality suggests that there are different ways of thinking about what it is that we're going to try to do to be fair. There's a question about equality of outcome. That is, you might think that what's really just is that everybody ends up at the same or roughly the same quality of life. Okay? So let's just use humans. We'll keep the elephants aside for now. Everyone should have more or less the same outcome when we're thinking about any particular policy. No one, for example, should have to live too close to a toxic facility. No one should have to lose their home. One of the problems with equality of outcome, this idea of equality of outcome, is you're going to have to be having a constant body, whether it's a government body or some other body, redistributing all the time, right? Because how are you going to maintain that equality of outcome? You're going to have constant redistribution. That's going to cost a lot. And that cost may be better spent in different ways. This is one of the ways I think consequentialist or utilitarian views and justice views can come apart, right? It may make more sense to allow for outcome disparity that would lead to greater overall well-being, rather than have many, many bodies, organizations, states constantly reworking, constantly redistributing. So that's one of the worries about equality of outcome as a way of thinking about substantive equality. We might just say, no, okay, equality of outcome, that's not really what's at issue. What's at issue is that everybody should have an opportunity to have access to the goods and services and clean environments that others have. So maybe it should be equality of access. The substantive principle should be everybody should have equal access to the goods and services that others have access to. That's not a bad idea, but we already live in a world and in a country in which there are disparities. So just having access may not actually ensure that you reach anything like a better outcome. what are some of the reasons for thinking about that? Think about it just in terms of school. Suppose everybody, anybody who, let's say we had equality of access to Princeton. Everybody will maybe make it really fair by having the first, how big is a class? Let's say, how big?
1,300.
1,500? Okay, the first 1,500 people get into the Princeton class. Would that, okay, so the first 15 people who clicked, they had a better person working the clicker than me. It was really fair. Everybody did that. And so we would think of that as equality of access. Would that actually lead to a good outcome? Probably not. And the reason probably not is that some people wouldn't be ready like you guys are ready. Some people had disadvantages early on and hadn't had opportunities to correct for those disadvantages, so they wouldn't be able to take advantage of the access to this particular good. So that's one of the things to think about. So there's a problem with that. You might think that the way to think about substantive equality, and many, many people have thought that this is a way of thinking about substantive equality, is that we provide equality of opportunity, which ultimately is about leveling the playing field, right? So that there is going to be, in some way, some redistribution, but not constant redistribution in the way that you would need to do that if you had equality of outcome. You would be able to prevent some of the problems that are associated with equality of access because you're going to try to help people to achieve what they need to achieve. And that would mean equality of opportunity, not just that you get in the door, but you can't really do what you need to do once you're in the door. And it's not the case that you're constantly fiddling to try to make sure everybody has an equal outcome. But part of the reason I think it's important to think about the pros and cons of these different conceptions of substantive equality is it helps you to see that it's not just when you say, oh, everything is equal or everything should be fair, it's not that simple what it is that you're talking about. Now I want to now turn to different kinds of justice, ways of thinking about questions about what would lead to just outcomes. And I want to start with distributive justice because that's what I've been talking about. All of those different notions of equality are to some extent distributive justice notions. That is to say, so what it is that we're doing when we're thinking about distributive justice is trying to distribute or divvy out particular kinds of goods, whether it has to do with outcome distribution, access distribution, or opportunity distribution. And there's different ways of thinking about what should guide our distributive notions. One is that resources should be distributed based on need. So we have a different conception here. We should give people what they need. That would be a notion of justice. Or, this goes back to our clicker question, people should just be allowed to do what they wish with their justly acquired resources. If I work hard, I got my stuff fairly, I didn't steal from anyone, I made some good decisions, I now have more than somebody else, then this ownership notion of justice suggests that as long as I was fair in every transaction that occurred, then this is a just situation. And then another theory is one that says that resources should be distributed according to who deserves them. Now I want to take a couple minutes for you to try to figure out what you think of this by going spelunking. We're going to go spelunking. I'd like you to get in with everybody should be in a little group of 3. And I want you to discuss how you are going to deal with this scenario. Does everybody know what spelunking is? Yes? No? Okay, spelunking is when you go into caves. So you go exploring caves. So this is your story. You're exploring a cave with your two other people in your group, and it turns out that the front of the cave collapsed. So you're stuck in a cave. You're going to be saved, so don't worry. You're going to be saved, but it's going to be a while. And one of you in your group of 3 remembered to bring 2 power bars with them, but the rest of you don't You have water, but you don't have any food. So I want you to decide together now, while you're sitting in the cave with your 2 other people, what are you going to do? How are you going to distribute the power bars, if at all? Okay, go. What's going to be fair?
Just extrapolating from science, things like what what if it's like two full toilets or you start
like keeping the neurological like we should get
Okay, you're getting rescued from the cage now. So does anybody want to share what your thoughts were about the just distribution of the power box? What did you decide? What did you want to say? Yes.
I thought the first thing we'd think about is need. Like if someone was maybe like diabetic and needed like sugar or something, they would get it first. But if not, we thought just provided them with 3.
Okay, so maybe if somebody had low blood sugar or diabetes and needed the food, maybe they would get more. Okay, other thoughts? That's a nice way to do it. Did other people have ideas about how to distribute this? Did anybody who was in your group who brought the power bars thought, they're mine, you guys should have just brought your own power bars? You're all being generous. Is there any problem with thinking about just dividing it by 3, assuming there's nobody's sick?
We like had 3 people and one of the persons was like 3/4 of the weight of the other 2. So calorically, the other 2 would need more, which then that could become very tricky.
Good. So what we're seeing is that sometimes these sort of notions of distribution have a lot of different features that you want to be thinking about if you're going to be fair. And often, you've probably heard this too, sometimes people have said, and this is related to the ownership one, well, if you brought the power bars, then you get to have, and you're going to distribute them, but you have a little more say, so maybe you get a little bit extra because you were thoughtful about it. You might say that somebody could break them into 3, but that's when they break them into 3, they don't get to also distribute them. It's sort of like the idea that, okay, you divide it, but somebody else gets to choose which ones they get. There's other ways of doing it. Anybody else come up with anything else in thinking about that? Okay, so this really works well when you have something like power bars to distribute, but some goods aren't distributable in these ways. And so what I wanted to also talk about is, and this is certainly true when we're talking about toxics and environmental kinds of damages, there are other issues about how we might think about justice in the context of non-distributional goods. One of these gets talked about as procedural justice. Procedural justice is a notion that there is something about the procedure for maybe the distribution, but it sort of happens prior to any distribution or outside of any distributional concern, where the procedure itself needs to be thought of in terms of justice. So what you guys were deciding about your distribution, you might have imagined that there was somebody who was being procedurally unjust in the spelunking instance. Probably not because you were friends when you went spelunking, but you could imagine that there might be some issues around how these decisions are made, whether they're fair, whether they're equitable. And this is certainly something that's come up in actual terms. The images here are images from Katrina, which we've talked about already, but the idea is that there's a sense in which, because of pre-existing decisions, procedures, policies that have been in effect, there's a disproportionate impact that is felt by those who are sort of otherwise already at a disadvantage. So one of the things that happened, we saw, is that there was a disproportionate number of low-income and Black people who were really in trouble when it came to the situation with Katrina. And even all these years later, it turns out that white people impacted by the destruction got $8,000 more from the federal government than Black people on average. And so this is something that really speaks to a problem with, potentially a problem with procedures, as opposed to distributional issues. One of the other things I wanted to highlight, and it comes up a lot in the environmental justice literature, is there's ways in which these procedures can be thought to be unjust, because you might have, for example, a meeting about, let's say, a fracking operation in the neighborhood, or a toxic siting in the neighborhood. So on the one hand, as we've talked about, fracking may actually be one of the solutions to the problem. Obviously, toxic siting is something that is just a quandary that we have to think about, and we haven't done much thinking about that in the class. But when we have these meetings, often the meetings to think about developing procedures are maybe conducted only in English, and there are Spanish speakers in the community that's going to be impacted. That would be potentially a procedural injustice. So you would have to think about how you would have to include translators in this, and we'll see in a minute why that's also important. But also sometimes think about this. A procedural problem could be you have a meeting, and it's good that you're having a meeting because you want to be inclusive and participatory, which we'll talk about. But you're going to have the meeting, let's say, at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, thinking quite reasonably that people will be off work. Well, it's not necessarily true, because there's the second shift, not the first shift, for people in many, many communities. Also, there may be people who have childcare needs that they can't have covered. So these are procedural justice issues. I'm trying to give you a specific example of the ways in which, when you're making decisions and you're trying to be fair or just in these decisions, there's other kinds of issues that you need to be attentive to. And one of these, as I was just suggesting, is this notion of participatory justice. And we're going to be it's going to be really exciting. Friday, our guest lecturer, Chris Cuomo, has been doing what's called participatory research with Native people in Alaska about climate change. And she'll be talking about that participatory research. But one of the things that I think is really, really central in thinking about environmental justice and environmental injustice is how to think about who gets to make the decisions. Not just who gets to come to the meetings, but who gets to participate in the decision-making processes in terms of how environmental burdens and benefits are distributed. And I think, importantly, making it the case that more quote-unquote stakeholders are at the table is going to be central in thinking about really creating just outcomes and just solutions to the environmental nexus. Now, one of the things that's really important is thinking that when you have more and different people at the table, there's complications about recognition and identity, and those can't be distributed. So I want you to just spend 1 minute, just 1 minute, talking to some of the people that you were just talking to in your cave, spelunking, about why you would think you would want to have, or what's some reason that you might have for wanting to include a more diverse group of people to recognize different identities, different people from different kinds of backgrounds. Why would you want them included in this discussion? Why does participatory justice seem like an important thing? Just 1 minute, spend time talking about that.
Not me.
Let's hear some reasons. Let's hear some reasons. Because one of the reasons I want to read. Participatory justice is another thing that's going to be a little bit more costly, right? It's not as costly as the kind of regular redistributive justice might be. So we need some reasons why we should think that participatory justice really matters. What did you come up with? Any reasons that you could share?
If they're not like at the table discussing it, you don't know what their experience is and you can't make judgments for them.
Could you just sit down and tell me?
You can't, like, if you don't have their experience, you can't know what would be best for
Okay, so that's an epistemological issue, right? So question about knowledge, you want more people so that you have better knowledge. Okay, good. Any other ideas? Yeah.
It's easy to make a decision that doesn't benefit a group or that harms a group of people if none of them are present and you don't have to look any of them in the eye, will be held accountable.
Okay, good. So there's a sense in which you could maybe sort of occlude. You don't have to actually, you get a little bit of a buffer from the impact of your decisions, and this would remove that buffer. Any others? Yeah.
I mean, there is a sort of like history of extraction and injustice, and so, I mean, in respect to like environmental burdens, like take for example imperialism. So participatory justice would implement justice for those past misgivings.
Okay, so it could be some sort of, by including people who have been previously excluded, it's one way of making restitution of some sort. Okay, that's a good thought. Other ideas about why to include? Any others? Reasons? Nobody else? Well, one of the reasons that we didn't even mention is consent and understanding. One of the things that's going to justify any kind of notion that this is a just solution or this is a just distribution of benefits and burdens is that the people who are impacted agreed to it. Okay, so let's go back to our toxics for a minute. One of the things that does actually happen, we have to get rid of these toxics. Again, we're not going to give them to each other. We're not going to like hide them in the backyard and hope the dog doesn't dig them up or throw them over the fence. We say, not my backyard, I'm going to put it in your backyard. If you're really going to make reasonable decisions about what to do, the best way to get these decisions made is not to say, right, we're going to put this radioactive material on native lands, or we're going to send this toxic waste to that part of the Bronx where we keep sending it and nobody really knows what it is. But if you get consent and you're able to get an understanding and agreement, then you might be justified in a particular kind of siting decision. Or let's say you decide that we're going to try to put this nice pile of computer toxins in somewhere in Princeton. Well, we would definitely want to make sure that the people here knew what was happening and understood, and maybe we would do that because we think people here will have a better chance of figuring out how to contain it and perhaps clean it. So in any event, when we include others that are going to be impacted, stakeholders, we are getting consent and understanding, and that might serve to achieve better justice. Also, bringing others to the table helps in the process of translation. Translating the economic issues, translating the ethics issues, translating the science issues, translating the risk issues. Sometimes having more people at the table, more people as part of the conversation, will help to get a bigger and broader understanding. And we'll see in the lecture next on Friday that is certainly the case. Those people who are living every day, watching how climate is impacting their day-to-day lives, sometimes people who are in their 80s, who don't actually have much formal education, have more insight into what's happening that can contribute. So it's not just that we want to do it because people were otherwise sort of victims of exclusion, but they might actually have something that they can bring to the table. Okay, there's one other kind of justice, finally, that I wanted to mention, and it's called compensatory justice, and it gets back to this idea that some people have been not just excluded, but systematically forced to suffer all sorts of environmental problems. And I think this is one of the sort of interesting issues around compensatory justice. There is an important sense in which, in many places in this country, and in many places in which the United States and the developed countries have interacted with the developing countries, as it were, there are these disproportionate burdens that have been put in, that have consistently over time accrued. And so there's this notion of compensatory justice that is about how it is that you might correct or repair some of the harms that were caused by this injustice. And given that we were recognizing through participatory justice that we need to recognize that there are very different ways of being, compensatory justice isn't as straightforward as you might think. So for compensatory justice, you might think, okay, the way to solve this problem, let's go back to this Katrina example that I gave you a minute ago. We shouldn't be giving black families $8,000 less than white families. Let's just give everybody the same amount. That would be compensatory, right? Does that sound like it's compensatory? We're going back to this sort of equal distribution idea. Or if it's the case that we've disproportionately cited facilities that are called Superfund sites. Does everybody know what a Superfund site is? What's a Superfund site? Anybody want to tell us? Superfund site? Yes.
It's a site that has been deemed so toxic that they had to shut down the waste dump there and fill it in with gravel and whatnot, and then just be like, hey, people don't go here.
Yes, it's a place where people don't go to. You don't go to these places because they're toxic in various ways. They may be very hard to remediate. There's a number of, I don't have it off the top of my head, there's a number of Superfund sites that are on a registry for cleanup and remediation. There's a disproportionate number of Superfund sites that are on tribal lands. That's why I use this. These aren't brownfields. These are serious places where health impacts, certainly environmental impacts, but human health impacts are a worry. So what are you going to do to compensate for that? And I use this in particular for a particularly important example. Well, you might think, oh, well, we should move people away from these Superfund sites. But we moved these people there in the first place before we turned them into Superfund sites, right? This is part of the whole colonial legacy of the country. So it seems like that would be a pretty problematic thing. And also, importantly, sometimes just paying compensation isn't actually going to be real compensation, because the loss that has accrued is not something that we can compensate. Okay, so part of the reason I thought this was a useful example is that when you're talking not just about the loss of a particular culture, but also thinking about the land as now being not the kind of space that you can form relationships with, and that land may have its own meaning or have developed its own meaning over time, it does seem that the compensation isn't going to be possible. And so I just wanted to close with this notion that all of our attempts at justice are complicated. The notion of justice and throwing around justice, you want to ask difficult questions about what you mean by it, whether or not you're thinking about it in terms of resource distribution, whether you're thinking of it in terms of who's at the table, whether you're thinking about it in terms of formal equality, or whether there's more substantive ways of trying to achieve it. Sometimes it's not going to be achievable. And I think it's important, sorry to be the bummer, but I think when we're talking about some of the solutions that we've talked about this past week to the environmental nexus, there might still end up being losers. And it's important to, I think, pay attention to that. Okay, so those are the learning goals that you're going to have. And I have questions for you.